Perhaps the most common element of any building is walls. So in this video, I'd like to introduce you to the wall tool, and we're going to focus mainly on the basic mechanics of drawing walls. So you can find the wall tool on the architecture tab. It's right here, or you can use the keyboard shortcut WA. Now your interface will change. That takes you into wall creation mode. The most obvious thing that you see is the modify place wall tab is now tinted in this greenish color. Next, right beneath that, you will see a series of shapes and controls. These are the shape of the walls that you're drawing. More on that in a few moments. Beneath the ribbon, you will see that the options bar has populated with lots of settings, starting with height and unconnected and location line and so on. And so we'll talk about a few of those. And then the last part of the interface that changes is on the properties palette. You can see that at the top of the properties palette, it says that we are currently drawing a basic wall, and it might say generic 8-inch if you're working in imperial, or generic 200 if you're working in metric. So for this first example, we're not going to change anything. However, I do want to just point out these two buttons right here, auto join and auto join and lock. For this example, I want to make sure that neither of those is selected. Now you can tell if it's selected because when you click on it, it will change to this blue tinted color there. So you can see that only one of those can be selected at a time. But if you want neither of them to be selected, just click it again. So just make sure that neither of those is selected. Otherwise, the behavior on screen will be different than what I'm showing. And that's a more advanced feature that we're not going to get into right now. Okay, so how do you draw a wall? Well, it's really like just sketching lines. Okay, so every wall has two ends, and all you need to do is click a start point and click an end point, and you've created a wall. Now, the next thing you'll notice is that it's trying to create a second wall that starts where the first wall ended up, and you could click a third point or a fourth point or a fifth point. That sequence of walls is referred to in Revit as a chain. Now, there's two ways you can control the chain behavior in wall creation mode. One is with this checkbox right here. Notice that it is selected. If I deselect that, the next point I click will break the chain. I'm still in the wall tool, but now each time I create a wall, they're going to be completely independent. They won't be connected to the original. I never do that. I always leave chain turned on because if I want to draw a chain, I can easily do it. And if I want to break the chain, what you do instead is press your escape key once on your keyboard. Notice that that serves the same function. It disconnects me from the end of this wall, allows me to start creating a new chain, and I didn't have to check or uncheck the box in order to do it. So yes, you can uncheck the box, but I recommend just using the escape key. If you press escape twice, that takes you all the way out of the command. Okay, so keep in mind that if you're just trying to break the chain, only press the escape key one time. Multiple times will take you out of the command. So I'm going to go back into the wall tool, and now let's just look at some of the other shapes here. Most of these are self-explanatory. You could draw a rectangle. It's just two opposite corners. You could draw a polygon. That starts from the center, and then you're dragging out the shape of that polygon. The number of sides of the polygon would be indicated right here. So if I wanted to do an octagon, I could change that number. You can draw that polygon either to the vertex or to the side. So it just depends on which one of those you choose, inscribed or circumscribed. You can draw circles. There's arcs and ellipses. There's a variety of different shapes. Now, I'm going to go to this one here, start and radius arc. This one kind of works in a combination of drawing a straight line and drawing a curve, because you're going to draw the two endpoints of the arc first and then set the amount of curvature. And you do that either with the mouse on screen or by typing in a number. But what I wanted you to see is that you can actually draw these in chain as well. So when you're doing this, it'll even try to snap tangent if you pay attention to the little on-screen cues. Now, you're not required to draw a tangent. You could draw any shape you want there, and they will still be in chain. They just won't be tangent necessarily. Okay, I'm going to click the Modify tool to cancel out of there. Feel free to try any of the other shapes that you'd like to try. And I think most of them are pretty self-explanatory in terms of just following the kind of on-screen cues and so forth to be able to draw those different shapes. Now, I want to get rid of all these walls that we've drawn and draw some a little bit differently. And so that means that what I'm going to do is start out here in empty space. I'm going to click and start dragging a box until I've surrounded all of the walls. Now, you will notice that it's selecting more than just the walls. So you want to be careful here. Don't press delete yet. There's a filter button here on the ribbon. We're going to click that. We're going to click the check none button here, and then make sure you only select the walls checkbox. I've got 44. Your quantity will be different depending on how many walls you drew. When I click OK, only the 44 walls are selected for me. Now I'll press delete, and I won't lose any of the other items that were on screen. So it's kind of important. If you're getting error messages about deleting views and other things like that, then you want to cancel that or undo because you have too much selected. So make sure you're just deleting the walls. All right, so let me zoom back out here so I can see the full screen. Go back to my wall tool. And now what I want to do is I want to draw some walls that are just simple straight lines. So I'm going to draw one here that is maybe about 25 feet long in imperial. If this is metric, then that's going to be about 6,000, 7,000 millimeters, somewhere in that range. And then press escape once and then draw it again from here to here, escape once from here to here. And let's continue that and create 5 separate walls here. And then let's draw one more over here that's in the opposite direction. And then let's click the modify tool to get out of there. Now, what I want to focus on with these walls is the heights. Now, we're not seeing the heights here from a floor plan. So we're going to set those heights first here in the floor plan, and then we're going to look at a different view to understand how they're configured. So this first one and this second one here on the screen, I'm going to leave those largely the way they are. The first one, I'm going to leave it alone entirely. The second one, I just want to come down here and you can put in a different value for the property called unconnected height. Okay, so it's currently 20 feet in the imperial file, 6,000 millimeters in the metric file. And what I want to do is change that to 15 feet imperial or 4,500 millimeters if you're working in metric. So that's one way that you can set the height of the walls. You can just explicitly type it into that unconnected height property. Here's another way. I'm going to select this wall, the third one over, and instead of the top constraint being left at unconnected, notice that that's a drop-down menu, and there are other choices there. So we could make this third wall over go up to level 2. Now notice that the unconnected height is now grayed out at a fixed value. That fixed value is the distance between level 1 and level 2. Now I'm going to repeat that for the fourth wall over, make that one go up to L3, and the final one, make that one go up to L4. Okay, so I've now got these 5 horizontal walls, each set to a different height. Let's take a look at those directly, and we can do that by opening up this section view right here. Now, we've been in this view in previous videos, but the way you open it is to just simply select it, right-click, and choose Go to View. So now you can see that we've got our 4 levels, and if you watch the video on levels, then you understand how those were put together. And then we've got our 5 walls here and then our perpendicular one there, which we're going to look at in just a few moments. So let's start with these 2 on the left. These were both left set to unconnected. So you could now come over here and type in a different value and go ahead and just put in any value you like. And notice that the height of that wall will change. And it only affects that one wall that you have selected. Now contrast that to the behavior of these walls over here, the ones on the middle and the right. If I select L2, the second level, and I start to move that, notice that it adjusts the height of the wall that is attached to it. If I came in and selected another wall and also assigned that to L2, and then I move that level, you're going to see that both of those walls are adjusting. So being able to set the height of the walls relative to a level above is a very efficient way for you to control the heights of lots of walls in your project without having to select them one at a time and manually make those adjustments. So that's a design decision that you get to make with each wall that you place in your project. Okay. In addition to the heights, you can set offsets above and below those heights. So this one goes up to L3, but I could add, say, a 2-foot height offset or 600 millimeters in the metric file. Just zoom in just a touch here so you can see it a little better. And it's still being controlled by the height of L3. It's just that now it's also maintaining that additional offset above that level. You can do negative offsets as well, so it doesn't have to be a positive number. Now for this final wall, I just want to show you one more feature that walls have. Their cross-section does not have to be vertical. That's the default, but you can choose also to make them slanted or even tapered. Now we're going to talk about tapered walls later in the course, but for now, let's just do a quick slanted example. So for the cross-section property here, I'm going to change it from vertical to slanted. That gives us an angle from vertical parameter. And if I let the tooltip expand, you can see that that angle can be either positive or negative. So just simply type in the number of degrees that you want that wall to slope, and you'll see that it now slants along that angle. You can couple this with the height parameter that we just talked about. And so that wall could jump up to level 3, and notice it will still maintain the angle. Or we could drop it back down to level 2 and it will maintain that angle. And in fact, we can even introduce top and base offsets and it will still maintain the angle. So feel free to experiment further in this file with any of those walls or any additional walls that you'd like to sketch and using any of those settings. Really, the goal is to just get comfortable with the basic function of the wall tool and the various settings that you can quickly manipulate on those wall properties. In this video, I want to dig a little deeper into some of the properties available on walls. Now we're going to look at both instance properties and type properties in this video. So I'm in a really simple file for this purpose. It's just this little 4 walls creating this little box construction here. You'll notice from the note on screen that we're in an imperial file only for both the imperial and metric exercise files downloads. So even though the units are in imperial, we're not really going to be talking about numbers at all in this video, so it doesn't really matter, okay? But I have gone ahead and put in metric values in any of the dimensions just in case you happen to be working in metric. But please be advised that the file is in imperial units for both downloads. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started here. What I want to do is start in this first view that you see right here called Floor Plan Levels of Detail. And I'm just going to simply double click that to open it up. And it's a very simple view that's just showing a zoomed in corner of 2 of the walls where they come together. And the thing, of course, that you'll notice is that these walls are only showing their thickness, the outermost thickness of the walls, and none of the internal construction. Now, these are brick walls that have a masonry backup and insulation and so on. And so there's a variety of different layers of material in these walls, but we're not seeing any of that in the current view. So this is the first thing I wanted to talk about, levels of detail. This is a view level setting that you can apply to each view, and it controls the display of elements like walls and floors and roofs and so on. But we're looking at walls here. And it's this little pop-up menu right here down on the bottom of the screen. So this is the view control bar, and the second icon over controls the level of detail. Coarse is what we're seeing right now. That will only show the outermost thickness of that assembly. So regardless of how many layers of material are in that wall thickness, we're only seeing its full outer dimension. If you change to either medium or fine, then you're going to see all that internal layer structure. Now, in the case of walls, it doesn't matter whether you choose medium or fine, you're going to see the same thing. But notice that when I do, I'm now seeing lots of different materials. So there's some drywall, there's concrete masonry units, there's insulation, there's an air gap, there's brick. However, you might notice that it's a little strange because the brick and the drywall seem to be on the wrong sides of the building, but we'll get into that in just a few moments. Before I switch to that though, let's talk about the line weights as they're displayed in this view. On my screen, you should be seeing that the outermost edge of the wall is a little bit bolder than the line work used to portray the inner layers. If you're not seeing that on your screen, if your screen looks more like this, then you've got something called thin lines turned on. And thin lines is persistent. Once you turn it on, it stays turned on until you turn it off. Now, I don't recommend that you have thin lines turned on for this video. In fact, I don't recommend that you have it turned on for this course. I'll tell you when to turn it on later in the course. as a diagnostic tool. But for right now, I think it's going to display things much nicer if you leave thin lines turned off. Now, it's a matter of personal preference. If you prefer to have thin lines on, that's your choice. But I just wanted you to see the difference of what it would look like between the two. And certainly for this video, I think it will look a lot nicer if you leave the thin lines off. So anyway, that's what we're seeing here. So let's switch views. Let's go down to the floor plan wall types view next here. And in this view, we're seeing the full structure now, all 4 walls, and we're also seeing some dimensions. And I've also added some simple blue lines here that represent some of the concepts that I want to talk about. Now, these are just simple drafted lines. They're not part of the wall, but they will serve the purpose of illustrating the concepts that I want you to see here, okay? Let's start with this wall up here. We already mentioned that the brick is on the wrong side of the wall. Now, it would be a little strange to have the brick on the inside of the building and the drywall on the outside, so we should probably address that. Well, all you need to do is flip the orientation of the wall, and you can actually do that with this little control right here. When I do, that's exactly what it will do. The drywall is now on the bottom side of the wall, the brick's on the top side of the wall, but of course it only affected that one wall that I flipped. Each wall has its own orientation. That worked well because of a feature called location line. And the location line of that selected wall was right here along this dashed blue line. In other words, right along the center of the wall's geometry. So if you flip the wall along its center line, it flips in place and the dimensions of your building are unaffected. Well, let's contrast that to the behavior of this wall, which I intentionally set the location line to something else. So you'll notice that there's these 2 little grip controls at the ends of the wall there. And if I flip the orientation of this wall, notice that it now favors that inside edge of the wall instead when it flips. It had an impact on the overall dimension. So the building used to be 28 feet long. It's now 26 and some change. Okay, so it's gotten smaller. And it also had an impact on the way that the other 2 horizontal walls connect into it. So it was a more dramatic change. Now, that turns out that's not what I wanted, because you can see the blue line here has been left behind, and I really intended for it to stay over there. So let's undo that. And how would we do that differently? So location line is the feature that controls this. And it's not so much that there's a preferred location line. It's just a matter of sequence and strategy. Any location line is fine. And in fact, there are 6 of them available in Revit. So before we talk about what the strategy is to this wall, let's talk about the 6 location lines. So I'm going to jump to our last view here called section location lines. And you can see a little section cut of the wall. And I've gone ahead and highlighted the concrete masonry unit portion of the wall in this green color, because that's what is considered the core of the wall. And what you'll notice is that there are 6 possible location line settings. Now, some are self-explanatory. Things like finish face interior, finish face exterior are just the outermost and the innermost faces of the wall. While center line is also fairly self-explanatory. That's literally the geometric center of the wall. But then if you consider the core, the green shaded area, you also have an inside face, an outside face, and a center line. So that's your 6 possible combinations. So I'm going to go ahead and close this view. That was just for information. And we can take any wall, I'll select this one, and using the location line drop down here, we can choose any one of those 6 possibilities. Now, the reason you do that is twofold. You do it before changing the wall's orientation, because as we saw a moment ago, the wall behaved a little bit unexpectedly when we flipped it, when it had the wrong location line. Or you might also do that in a second scenario, which we'll look at next, which is changing the thickness of the wall. But let's start with this first scenario of changing the orientation. What we want to do is to get it to behave like this wall up at the top. So we're going to change it to wall center line first. That moves those little grip controls. Now I can change its orientation. It will flip in place. The overall location still matches this blue detail line. The dimensions are unchanged, 18 by 28. Now, if I wanted it to have finish face interior or finish face exterior, I could make that change after the fact and the wall won't shift. So you can have any location line you want, but just keep in mind that when you flip the orientation of the wall, it will flip around that location line. So it does matter that you choose the appropriate one for whatever behavior you want the wall to have. Now, keep in mind, you can always select a wall and move it later. Okay. There's nothing preventing you from doing that. So if you accidentally have the wrong location line set, it's not a big deal. You can just move it back to where it needs to be. But if you want to control it without having to do the extra move, then think about your location line first. Okay. Now, you'll probably notice I have some different dimensions on screen here. And I did that just as a way to illustrate that sometimes folks misinterpret the value or the function of the location line. The location line does not control dimensioning in any way. In fact, if you look at this dimension string here, you can see that we're able to dimension every single layer of the wall independently, regardless of location line. So location line has nothing to do with dimensioning. It has everything to do with either what I just showed you, changing the orientation, or let's look at one other option, changing the thickness of the wall. Now, thickness of the wall is not a property that's available here on the properties palette. The thickness of the wall is controlled by the type of wall that you assign to it. Okay. So in this case, the exterior brick on CMU wall is controlling how thick that wall is. But if I open up the type selector, there are other choices available, such as this one, generic brick, which is significantly thinner. When I choose that, you will see the wall becomes thinner, but notice that once again, it has left this little blue line behind. That's the face that I had wanted it to maintain. It didn't do that. Why? Well, once again, it has to do with location line. So let me undo that, select this wall. Now, first of all, we should probably fix the orientation, right? So let's do that first. Then I want to maintain that outermost face now. So I'm going to do location line, finish face exterior. Then when I change this to generic brick, it will shift in place, and notice that it will maintain that outside face. So that's the key, right? So you're thinking about the location line in those two scenarios, when you're changing the wall's orientation or when you're changing its thickness. There really isn't any other time that you need to be concerned about it. Okay. So let me flip this last one. And then now let's direct our attention to type-based properties. So exactly what do I mean by type-based properties? Well, let's go ahead and do a quick demonstration here. You can select any one of these three masonry walls. So it doesn't matter which one. And I'm going to instead go to the Edit Type button this time, instead of trying to find the properties I want directly on the Properties palette. Now, when you get to the Edit Type window, it will look something like this. It may or may not be showing a preview over here. So there's a preview button down at the bottom that controls that. So let's go ahead and turn that on. I think that's helpful. And then I'm going to click this Edit Structure button right here. And if this is all compressed and hard to read, you can just sort of stretch this to make it a little bit more legible. So let's make a change that will be immediately obvious on screen. The first layer is selected here. It's called Finished Masonry. I'm going to delete it. And then I'm going to keep doing that, delete, delete, delete for the 4 exterior layers on the exterior side of the wall. I'm going to leave everything else. Okay, so your preview should look like this, and let's click OK. Now, I'm going to get a couple warnings here because I had previously dimensioned those layers that I was deleting. So let's remove the references on those dimensions, and let's click OK here to say that we're fine, that the overrides don't apply anymore. Trust me, both of those are perfectly fine. And then let's click OK one more time. And this is what I wanted you to see. Notice that the change has applied to all 3 of the walls, regardless of the fact that I only had one wall selected. Now, that's pretty dramatic. So you want to make sure in your own projects that that's what you intended to do. So one failsafe that you can do to help you in a situation like that is, instead of doing it the way I did, where you just sort of plow in there and you change an existing type, what we can do is undo that. Let's click that again. There we go. So click undo twice there, it looks like. Select the wall. And then this is the more standard best practice way to do it. Go to Edit Type, duplicate the wall first, and give it a unique name. So I'm just going to call this Exterior CMU, remove the 2 on the end there, click OK. I'll click Edit Structure, make it a little wider again, and I'm going to repeat the same process. I'm going to remove those 4 exterior layers. Looks good, click OK again. I'll get the remove references and the OK, and it's talking about this dimension right here. Okay, so it just didn't make sense anymore because it was trying to dimension layers that no longer existed. Notice that the change only applied to this one wall. The difference is that now I can select these two walls and go to the type selector here, and my new wall type exists on the list, and I can choose it, and you'll see it applies to the other instances. The reason that's considered more of a best practice is we've preserved the original, which is this one right here. And so we now have both wall types available to us, and you could apply them as needed throughout your model, and it's a little bit less destructive, right? So I'm not saying you will never edit a type directly and make the change directly, but more often than not, you're going to do edit type duplicate first. But what's important for you to understand in this video isn't so much whether or not you edit the type and duplicate it or not duplicate it. It's that you understand the difference between instance and type-based properties. Instance-based properties, you have to select the object and interact directly on the properties palette. Type-based properties, you go to edit type, and it will potentially apply to multiple instances throughout the model, unless, of course, you do the duplicate first.
In this video, we're going to talk about snap behavior. There are two kinds of snapping that we have in Revit. We have increment snapping and we have object snapping. And so I'd like to illustrate both of those. And both of them are similar in a function. They help you build your model with more precision without necessarily having to input exact values in order to do so. So let's start with increment snapping. Stay zoomed out for this because what I want to do is show you kind of a built-in behavior that we benefit from when we're just simply drawing things like, it really works with any geometry, but you're really going to see it with things like walls and lines when you're drawing those. So I'm going to start the wall command and just click anywhere to start drawing the wall. And then I'm going to slowly start moving over to the side here. So you're going to see a dimension appearing there on the screen. And notice that if I move slowly, the increment that that dimension is changing in is a fixed increment. So in my case, it's every 6 inches. Okay. Now I'm going to roll the wheel down a few clicks to zoom out. And you'll notice that that has an impact on that snap increment. So now you'll see that the increment has changed to every 4 feet. Now the increments are slightly different in the metric file, but you should witness the same behavior. The further out you're zoomed, it will use a much coarser increment, and the closer in you zoom, it'll use a much more detailed increment. So if I zoom the other way, and let's zoom in here close enough to begin seeing it. There you go. At that point now, notice that I'm getting every inch. And if I keep going even closer still, eventually it's going to get down to the 1/4 of an inch. And in the metric file, I believe it gets down to the millimeter or possibly even finer than that. So just zoom in and out to see this behavior. You don't even need to click and create the wall. You're just simply watching it on screen there. Now, the other benefit of this snapping behavior is if I see a value of 3'3" there, I can trust that value. So I'm going to click to place that wall. I'm going to double escape to get out of the command. I'm going to come back and click this little measure tool up here on the quick access toolbar. Think of this as like a tape measure. And then I'm going to click right here at the end of that wall and then over here at the end of that wall. And you'll see that it's exactly 3'3" or whatever increment you set it to. So when you use that increment snapping behavior, it is accurate. Okay, so you can trust it. So that is one way that you could draw with precision. Now, the other thing I should point out is we just saw our first example of object snaps when I measured this object. That little purple square there at either end, those are object snaps. And that's how I knew I was snapping exactly to the endpoints of that wall. Now, I'm going to zoom out a little bit more here and I'll go back to the wall command again. And we also have increment snaps for angles. So if you kind of watch the angles here, notice that I'm never getting fractional angles. Even though it's going to 2 decimal places, those 2 decimal places are always zeros because the default increment is every 1 degree. However, there are also some built-in angles which are useful to us. 45 degrees. 90 degrees, horizontal and vertical, right? So you can snap to any of those preset increments just simply by clicking when you see that little indicator on screen, or knowing that even if you're going at some random angle, you're never at a fractional degree, you're always at a whole degree increment. Right? So those are the increment snaps. So those are kind of nice because if you set them to a value that you want as sort of your minimal, then you know that even if you eyeball something, it's going to be within that tolerance. Now, the last thing I want to talk about with increment snaps is if I start here and I'm moving along and you can see that it's giving me the fixed increments. Notice what happened though when it senses other geometry. So it will always try to snap to other geometry. And notice that just goes down to this really fine fractional increment the minute I did that, right? So if I come over here a little further, right, go back right there, right? It goes really fine and then really fine, or the same thing over here, really fine. So the increment snaps only apply when there's nothing else nearby that's more precise. So that's why I want you to think of it as kind of like the benchmark. That's sort of like the underlying minimum, but you can always snap with exact precision. If I wanted to line up with this wall precisely, I know I can do that because Revit's always on the lookout for those alignments. Okay. Now, this little assembly that I have down here is just for you to practice object snaps, and there are several of them. So I've already shown you endpoints, right? They use that little square symbol. You can also do midpoints. That's that little triangle symbol. You can also do tangent relationships. You can do quadrant relationships. You can do intersections. Intersections is like this little X right here. So you can see how it's doing the apparent intersection between the circle and the straight line. When you click, it has precisely snapped to that location. Okay. And there are a bunch of these. If you wanted to snap to the center of this circle, you can start right here on the circle itself, and then either right click, go to snap overrides and choose centers. And then it will find the center of that arc. And I'm starting right there. Or another way to get to that same thing is to use keyboard shortcuts. SC is snap to center, and it will snap right to that. Now, I've got a view over here called Snap Symbol Legend. And this is just sort of like a quick little cheat sheet that I threw together for you for the object snaps. It tells you the keyboard shortcuts in parentheses and then the symbols I've just drawn there with simple geometry. Okay. Now, you can configure the behavior of any of these snaps that we've witnessed so far. And to do that, that's on the Manage tab. And you're going to be looking for the snaps command, which is right here. And when you click that, the increments for linear dimensions are here. The increments for angular dimensions are here. All the object snaps are in the middle, including their keyboard shortcuts. If for some reason you don't want it to look for certain snaps, you can uncheck them. So if I didn't want it to look for tangents or I didn't want it to look for perpendiculars, you could uncheck those. I typically don't. I typically leave everything turned on, but that is an option that you have available. There are also some specialized snaps. And the last one that I want to show you is this one right here, snap mid between 2 points. So I'm going to cancel out of here. And then I'm going to start drawing a wall. And I want to start kind of right here in the middle between these two walls here. So you can either right click, snap overrides, snap mid between 2 points, or you can use the keyboard shortcut, which is S2. Either one. Pick your first point and your second point, and notice that it's going to automatically figure out where the midpoint is between those two clicks. And then I've drawn a wall that's halfway between those. Okay. So if you'd like to experiment further in this file, feel free to do so. You can try each of the object snaps, try changing the increment snaps, and just get a general feel for how the snap behavior functions.
When you're getting ready to begin certain modeling tasks, it can sometimes be really helpful to have a dedicated view just for the purpose of getting your modeling task done. We often refer to these as working views. So a working view is nothing special. It's just another view in your model. But what makes it special, what makes it different is you're setting up the configuration of that view specifically for the purposes of some behind the scenes task. In other words, this is a view that you keep private for yourself and your team, not one that you're going to share with any outside recipients. Another way you could think of it is if you were doing work in a workshop, you would probably show the people that come to visit you the final product you created in the workshop, and you wouldn't necessarily take them into the messy back room where all the dust and the tools were all laying around. So you can almost think of a working view that way. However you think about it, what I'd like to do in this video is just show you how to set up a quick working view, and I've got a very specific task in mind. In the next video, we're going to be laying out the wall geometry for the interior of a 2-bedroom condominium unit. You can see I've already created the exterior outline to get us started here. But what I would like to do is have a view that focuses right in on that geometry and makes it easier for us to perform that task. So that's going to be the subject of what we're going to do here together in this video. Now, the template we use to start with already contains some working views. So rather than start completely from scratch, we're going to repurpose the one that's already there. So we are here on the project browser, floor plans, architectural plan. But if you look a little bit further down here in the coordination branch, you will see floor plans working plan. If you expand that, there is a L1 and L2 working view. So we're going to do L1, the level 1 floor plan here, and I'm going to zoom in near the geometry. Now you can see that the walls are showing here, and they're showing their layered assembly structure. And if you watched an earlier video where we talked about that, you know what that represents. You know, there's the brick and the drywall and so forth. And I don't think for the purposes that we're going to be doing here in this layout task, it's going to really require any of that. So the first thing we're going to do is come down here to the view control bar, and we're going to set the display level here to coarse. Now, again, from that earlier video, you may remember that when you go to coarse level of detail, it hides all of that internal geometry. And that just makes things a little bit simpler for us to work on. Now, the next thing I want to do is just keep it focused on this small area here. So if we zoom back out a little bit, what we can do is we can hide anything that's not pertinent to the task at hand. That includes these dashed boxes out here, which are scope boxes, this dashed line, which is a reference plane, these elevation and section symbols. And what you can do is just kind of start out here outside the model, click and drag until you're crossing through all of that geometry like so. Now, I want to hide not only the stuff I have selected, but anything that's like it. So we can do that by coming down here to this little pop-up on the view control bar. It's the temporary hide isolate pop-up. And there's a few different options. And one of them is hide category. If you choose hide category, it hides not only the things you selected, but everything else in that category. And therefore it achieves exactly what I was looking for. Now, if you right click anywhere and go to zoom to fit, it will zoom in nice and close on just our building geometry. And this is exactly what I was looking for. Just a nice, clean working view that shows me the outline of the building, and I can focus on doing that internal layout task. Now, the trouble is this is temporary hide isolate as indicated by this little label here in the upper corner. If I were to save this file, close it, and reopen it tomorrow, all of that stuff would come back again. So what I want to do is make that hidden geometry permanent in this view. So we can go right back to that little pop-up and choose apply hide isolate to the view. And the label disappears, but notice that it's still all hidden. We now have that nice clean view, and that's really all there is to it. Now, there's lots of other things you can do in a working view. This is not an exhaustive list by any chance, but I've specifically designed what I've chosen to do in this working view based on the task that I intend to use it for, which means that in the future, you might very well create multiple working views for different purposes. If you find yourself in that situation, simply right-click the view and you can go to this duplicate option and create another copy that you set up another way. So you could create one for laying out walls and another one for configuring the ceilings and another one for calculating areas and square footages, whatever you want. Okay, so you can have as many views as is necessary in order to help you perform the task at hand. In this video, we're going to perform the wall layout required for a small 2-bedroom condominium layout. So we're going to work with the wall tool, but we're going to approach it a little bit more systematically and strategically than we did in earlier videos on walls, because here we have a specific architectural layout in mind that we're trying to create. So we're going to use a process that I like to refer to as sketch, then modify, or I sometimes also refer to it as progressive refinement. Now, these are not official Revit terms, but it is an official Revit concept. In other words, you typically start off by laying out elements in approximate locations, roughly where they need to be. And then over time, as you learn more about your design and make more decisions, you slowly and progressively refine that layout to a more complete configuration. So Revit lends itself to that with a variety of tools, including some that we've already looked at, like temporary dimensions, and with a variety of other tools that we'll look at in the future. So let's start here in this working view that I'm in, L1 working, and the wall tool, or you can type WA. It defaults to the generic 8-inch wall, and I'm going to change that to the interior 4 7/8 inch partition if you're working in the imperial file, and if you're working in the metric file, that's going to be interior 123 millimeter partition. In either file, the next thing you want to do is start moving your mouse near the center line of this top wall here, and you'll notice a dimension will either appear going to the wall at the left or the wall at the right, depending on which one you're closer to. So it doesn't really matter where exactly you place this wall, but just so that it's kind of favoring the wall on the right there, you can click that first start point and you want to start moving your mouse down. Now, as we've already seen in earlier videos, you can draw this wall at any angle you like, but it should snap nicely to standard angles like 90 and 45 and so forth. So what we want to do is pull it straight down at a 90 degree, click somewhere, and then turn the corner also at 90 degrees, and then come again and click into the center line of this exterior wall over here. Now, when you do, that should give you this little boxed out corner there, and it should break the chain. Now, what do you do if it didn't break the chain? Let me show you that again. I'm going to start maybe right about here this time, and I'm going to come over to about that location, click a point, pull it straight down, but this time I'm going to stop at the face of the exterior wall and click, and you might have witnessed this with the earlier wall. So what happened in that case is, because I didn't go to the center line, it just defaults to continuing the chain. Now, it's no big deal. We've talked about chain before in a previous video. You can simply press the escape key one time, and that will break the chain, and then you can continue. So what we want to do is add another small space up here. So at the top of the plan, we're going to have a bedroom with a small toilet room next to it. We're going to have a walk-in closet right here, and then another toilet room here. And then for this bedroom down at the corner, we're just going to do a little L-shaped wall there to create a closet. Now, you'll notice that I didn't pay any attention to the exact positions of where I placed those walls. That was deliberate. This is the sketch part of the process. Your job is to just roughly get those walls in their approximate locations. Then we're going to click the modify tool to cancel out of the wall tool and move on to the modify part. So remember, the process is sketch, then modify. So how do we do that? Well, now we're going to fine tune the positions of all of these walls to meet our design needs. So I'm going to start with this wall right here, and you simply want to select it. And when you do, you should see some temporary dimensions appear on the left and the right. Now, we've encountered temporary dimensions before, but they're a very common tool, so it's worth repeating some of the basics here. The most important thing when working with temporary dimensions is making sure that you're clicking the number and not this little symbol down below it. If you click that, notice the tooltip says it's going to make that temporary dimension permanent. And if I click away from that wall, I now have a dimension there. Now that's useful, and in some cases that may be what you want, but that's not what we want right here. So I'm going to select this dimension, press the delete key, and then try again. I'm going to pick this wall, and what I want to do instead is click right on that numerical value instead. That will activate it as a piece of editable text, and now I will type in the value I want. Now, if you're working in the imperial file, you want 8 foot 1 inches. And again, you can either do 8 foot symbol 1 or 8 space 1. If you're working in the metric file, put in 2575, 2,575 millimeters. Notice that that will move the wall over to the right. Now, the next thing I want to do is set the size of the toilet room next to it. Here's a very common mistake. Folks say, well, I got a dimension right there. Let me just go ahead and edit that. And I'll put in 5 in the imperial file or 1525 in the metric file. And notice that the same wall moves back to in the other direction. That's because I had that wall selected. So let me do Control Z once to undo. And the most important thing to keep in mind about temporary dimensions is what you have selected is what will move. So it wasn't this wall that I wanted to move a second time. It was this one. So notice that when I pick that second wall, I get a new set of temporary dimensions. Now, another thing that I wanted to point out about temporary dimensions that you may have noticed on your own is they're kind of immune to zooming. So right now it's a little difficult to read the number that's right here on the one on the left on my screen. So you might be tempted to zoom in and get a better look. But notice what happens when you zoom in. The size of the dimension text is unchanged. It just kind of continues to be the same pixel size on screen. So that's something you're just going to have to get used to with temporary dimensions. There's no way to zoom in or out on that text. It will always be a consistent size. Now, it is possible to go to the File menu, go to Options, and there's a setting under Temporary Dimensions in Options that allows you to change the size of that text. But again, it's a fixed size that will stay consistent as you zoom in or out. Okay, I'm going to leave mine the way it is because I'm content with the size of the text as it is, but I just wanted to show you that strange little anomaly there. So let me edit this value, the one on the left here, and in the imperial file, I'm going to make that 5. If you're working in metric, go with 1525. And let me zoom back out so I can see the whole plan here. Okay, so now I'm going to direct my attention to this wall. Now, this wall is a little bit different because, as you'll notice, as you move that wall, it stays connected to all of these other walls and they all shape and resize along with it. So that's why this sketch but modify approach is so effective, because simply moving a couple walls can have an impact on the majority of the layout in a floor plan. So it's a very powerful way to work. So let's select this wall. And I'm going to use this top value here. And in the imperial file, I want it to be 10. In the metric file, that's 3000. So next I'm going to move over to this closet and I want the value here to be 5'3" in imperial or 1550 if you're working in metric. Again, remember to change selection to set the size of the bathroom. That's 5 foot imperial or 1525 in metric. Next, I'm going to direct my attention to this closet. So let's start with this small wall at the top here of the closet. It's a little bit too close to the wall above it. Now, we could type in this value right here if we knew what that distance is, but what I actually know is the distance from the exterior wall to the top surface of this wall. So you may recall that we've got these little grip controls on our temporary dimensions, and those can actually be moved around. Okay, so what I'm going to do is simply click that little dot, and you see how it jumps from the inside face to the middle. If I click it again, it jumps to the outside face. Now, if I click it one more time, it goes back to the inside. So each time you click, it jumps to a new location. So when it's at the location you want, you can then edit the value. And this is going to be 8'2" in imperial or 2500 in metric. And then I'll select this wall. And using that same technique, I can adjust that witness line to do the size of the closet. Now, in this case, as I've already indicated, if I zoom in, it doesn't increase the size of the text, but it might allow me to see the witness lines a little bit cleaner. So I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't ever zoom. I'm just simply saying that it won't affect the size of the text. But let's go ahead and click this one and then again, and then this is 2'8". And then I'll zoom back out. And now I need to set the size of this bedroom here. The trouble is, all of this is already sized correctly. This is all the correct size relative to each other. But I want to move them all together. But notice that when I make a selection of multiple objects, I'm not seeing any temporary dimensions. Well, it turns out that there's a button right here called Activate Controls and Dimensions. Yours might have been on already. This is a persistent control. So once you click it, it stays on until you turn it off. So just make sure that that's on. So I've done that. And now I get dimensions for that entire selection. Now, here's the thing. None of these is what I want to use. So notice that little grip control. And we've already talked about how you can click it and it will jump from center to face to face. Well, what we can also do is drag it. So I'm going to pick it up and drag it and then drop it onto the outside face right here. And that's the number I want to change. That is 12'7" in imperial or 3775 if you're working in metric. And that completes our basic layout of at least the left-hand side of our 2-bedroom condominium unit there.
In this video, we're going to continue with our 2-bedroom apartment unit layout, and I'm going to focus on the right-hand side of the plan, and I'm going to show you some different techniques this time. So we're going to focus on the Modify tools. So if we come over here to the Modify tab, you can see that there are several commands available to us. We've got Move and Copy and Rotate and Trim and Extend. So we're going to look at a number of these here in this video. Now I'm going to start with the Move tool right here. And the first thing I want to point out to you is that all of the tools in this little toolbox here have these animated tooltips. So I think it's worth taking a moment to watch the little animation. They can be very instructional in showing you how the command is intended to operate. So now that I've watched that little tooltip, I'm going to go ahead and click the Move tool. And there's two ways you can deal with selection on many of these commands. You can either select the element first and then run the command, or you can do it after you've run the command. Now, in my case, in this first example, I did not select anything first. Therefore, the first thing the Move command is asking me to do is to make a selection. Now, there was a tooltip on screen to that effect, but you can also see it down on the status bar in the lower left-hand corner of the screen. What it's telling me after the click to select and tab for alternates is that I can either use the Enter or the Space bar to finish the selection. So let me show you how that works. I'm going to select this wall right here. And then if I press either Enter or Space, that completes the selection and then moves me on to the next step of the command. The next step of the command is how far and in what direction you want to move it. So there's a number of ways you could do that. You could click points on screen. You can type in values. You can even use existing geometry to kind of set that distance. So let's say that I wanted to move this wall a distance that was equal to the width of this closet. So I could snap right to this endpoint right here, kind of drag over to this endpoint here and click again. And notice that it moves that wall. And of course, because it was connected to another wall, that other wall stays connected. Now that makes for a really narrow space there to the left. So perhaps I moved that a little bit too far. So I'm going to keep the wall selected, go right back to Move. This time, it goes right to the second step of the Move command, which is basically saying how far and where do you want to go, because it will assume that I'm trying to move the element I already had selected. So you can do the selection either way. I actually prefer this way. I like to make the selection first. I think that's a little bit more convenient, but it really is up to you which method you use. Now, this time I'm going to pick my start point right on the wall itself. I'm going to start moving horizontally to the right. And then as an alternative, you can type in your distance. So if I'm working in imperial, I'll type in 3 for 3 feet. If you're working in metric, you can do 900 millimeters. And you'll see that wall move over and reshape the spaces. Okay, so that's the real basics of the Move command. Now I'm going to keep that wall selected and move to the Copy command next, which is very similar to the Move command. In fact, most of the prompts are the same. The only difference is instead of moving the original object, we're making a copy of it. And what I'm going to do is pick a start point. And this time I'm just simply going to eyeball the second point to create a copy of that wall right next to the first one. Now, look at my options bar and you'll see some checkboxes. And notice that I've got a checkbox in the multiple option. So what that means is that I'm actually in multiple copy mode, which means that if I came somewhere else and clicked and clicked and clicked, I'm creating multiple copies of that object. And you can make as many as you want. When you're done making copies, you can either press Escape twice or click the Modify tool to cancel. Now, I don't really need these walls over here, so I'm going to just select all 3 of them and press the Delete key to get rid of them. There's also the Delete command right here, this little red X. So either one does the same thing. Okay, so that's one of the options that's on the options bar. And the thing to be aware of with the options for these commands is they remain persistent. So the reason multiple was already turned on for me is because the last time I used the Copy command, I checked the multiple option and Revit remembers that. The same is going to be true for the other commands. So for example, let's see what happens if we go back to this newly copied wall and try to move it. So I'm going to go to the Move command and I'm going to try and move it down a little bit. Well, notice that it does sort of move it down, but it left it connected to the wall up above, okay? Because by default, that's the way the Move command behaves. Well, if you go back to Move, there's an option on the options bar called Disjoin. If I check that, now what happens is if I pick the wall up and move it to a new location, it will disconnect itself from the previous wall. Now, the only thing I want to caution you on here is disjoin is a very specialized feature and It's useful in this situation, but a lot of times it can cause you a little bit of grief. So what I recommend that you do is go right back to the move command, uncheck disjoin, and then click the modified tool to cancel. This way, Revit will remember that disjoin was unchecked, and that will avoid some problems going forward in the future. And you might want to get in the habit of just doing that with any of the options that you don't want to be persistent. So disjoin is one of the ones that I find is particularly problematic. Okay, so let's move on to the next command that I want to show you, which is this one right here, the trim and extend to corner. It's got a keyboard shortcut of TR. So if you prefer, you can type those letters. So I'm going to go to that command, and the first way that I'll demonstrate it is over here in this bedroom. I'm going to select the horizontal wall right about there, and then this vertical wall right here. And what you'll see that it does is it actually trims off the part of the wall past where I selected it. Now, looking at that, that's probably not what I wanted. So let me reverse that by simply selecting two different walls this time to reclose up that cavity. So the way that this command works is you simply touch two objects, and based on the way that you select them and their current configuration, it will either trim their lengths down or it will extend their lengths out. So here's an example of when it would do extend. If I select this wall and then this wall, you'll see a little dashed line indicator of what the result is going to be, and it will extend those two walls together until they meet at a point there. Now, if you look at the status bar, you'll see that it says select the first line or wall to trim, and then it says click on the part you want to keep. This is important because it matters which side you click on. So let me click this wall here, and then if I click the bottom portion of this vertical line, I get one thing, Control Z to undo. If I pick the top portion, I get something else entirely. Control Z to undo. So just keep that in mind when you're using the trim and extend to a corner, that when you're trimming, it matters what side you click. Now, it doesn't really matter when you're extending because the wall's always going to get longer. Now, I want to make a little corridor here coming into the unit, and I want to base it off of this diagonal wall right here. So let me go to the modify tool to cancel, and I could do copy again, but there's another way to copy, and it's the offset tool. So the keyboard shortcut is OF. I'll go ahead and click that. And then there's some options on the options bar. So the first option is how far do you want to offset it? And you can put in any numerical value you want there. I'm going to put in 5 feet in imperial or 1500 millimeters if you're working in metric. Now, right next to that is a copy checkbox. I want to make sure that's turned on. Otherwise, it will move the object rather than copy it. And then the way that this works is you can highlight an object and then just simply move the mouse to determine which side you want the offset to occur. So I want to make sure that I'm highlighting this diagonal wall and then move slightly so that it's offsetting it down, and then I'll click and it copies that wall down to make that little corridor. I'll cancel out of the command. I'll come back to trim and extend to a corner. I'll pick the newly copied diagonal wall, and then very important, remember not to click the top half of this wall. You want to click the lower half so that it creates the correct corner condition like so. Now, you'll see here that this wall is a little too short. If I did trim and extend to corner, I'm not going to get what I want there. So I'm going to undo that. So instead, I'm going to shift to this trim and extend command. This one is a little bit different because you pick a boundary edge first. That's what you want to extend or trim to, and then the element you want to trim and extend. And in this case, it won't create an L condition, it'll create a T condition, and that's more appropriate for this situation. So let's click the modify tool to cancel out of there. I'm going to go to architecture and click wall, or you can type WA. I want to make sure I'm using the same wall type that we used for the other walls, and I'll just sort of box out a little pantry right here and a little utility room right here. And then I'll click the modify tool to cancel. So the next thing that I want to do is create an opening in this location here. So you might be tempted to go to trim and extend again, but the trouble is, remember that it's going to trim the entire wall, and it's going to generate this warning here that says that it can't keep elements joined. So let me cancel that. So what we're going to do instead is use split element. SL is the shortcut. Now you can use this command in one of two ways depending on the setting of this delete inner segment checkbox. If it's unchecked, you can split at a point, then go to trim and extend and do the cleanup, and we could repeat it on the other side. Or if I undo twice, I can check the box, delete inner segment, and now I can simply click 2 points here, and it will trim out that little segment in between. And so at this point, there's some fine tuning to do. We can adjust the size of some of these rooms and manipulate some of these spaces a little bit further. And I welcome you to experiment more with the various modification tools that are in here and with the layout in general, just to get a little bit more practice in. In this video, we're going to add some doors and windows to our layout here. So I'm continuing in the 2-bedroom apartment unit, and I will start with doors. So on the architecture tab, I'm going to click the doors tool, or you can type DR, the keyboard shortcut. Now, the default door in the Imperial file is a door passage single flush door that is 36 inches wide by 84 inches tall. If you're working in the metric file, then it will be door passage single flush, and it will be 900 millimeters wide by 2100 millimeters tall. So in both cases, we're going to accept that default, and let's go ahead and place one of those doors. Now, on the status bar at the bottom of the screen, it says click on a wall to place a door. Doors and windows are wall-hosted elements. So before you can place them, you must designate which wall you want them hosted to. So notice that the door doesn't appear until I start to move my cursor over some eligible wall. Now, I could place it on any wall that I like. Revit doesn't much care, but it does need to be on a wall. Now, where we want to place this door is in the entrance to the condo here. So I'm going to highlight this little diagonal wall off to the right to begin placing that door. Now, notice that if you move the mouse very subtly, you can get it to flip either into or out of the space. So I want to make sure it's flipping into the space, and then I will click to place it. That will display a few temporary dimensions. So notice that temporary dimensions work on any object, not just walls, and we can manipulate them the same way we were able to manipulate things when we were working with them with walls. So what I want to do here is on the hinge side of this door, I want to snug it into that corner a little bit closer. So I'm going to use 4 inches in the Imperial file, or 100 millimeters if you're working in metric. So I want to make several other single swing doors, but I want to use a slightly smaller size. So I'm going to come over here to the type selector and notice that this particular door family has several sizes. So I'm going to drop down to one width smaller. So 30 by 84 if you're working in Imperial, or 750 by 2100 if you're working in metric. So I want to place one here in this utility room. I want to place one up here in this bathroom. And again, you can modify the jam there. So I'll go to 4 inches. I'm going to place one here in this bedroom. And again, modify that to 4 inches or 100 millimeters. I will place one here in this bathroom, but this one I'm going to leave centered. However, notice that it's swinging up. Well, maybe I want it to swing down. So if we look down at the status bar at the bottom of the screen, in addition to saying click on a wall to place the door, it also says use the space bar to flip left or right. So let's do that. Let's just tap the space bar and notice that each time you do, it will change the swing direction. When it's pointing down, I will click to place it in that space. Let's do one here in this walk-in closet, tapping the space bar to orient it the way I want. And then in this bedroom, tapping the space bar to orient the way that I want. And then I'll edit this value to 4 inches or 100 millimeters. So those are all the single flush swinging doors that I want. Now I want to add a double door down here in this patio pointing out. So coming out of the living room there's going to be a patio in the lower portion of the plan. Now, the only double door that I currently have loaded is this double flush door here. So for now, I'm going to choose that. And in the Imperial file, I'll choose the 72 by 84 inch size. If you're working in metric, use the 1800 by 2100 millimeter size, and just place it centered in this space and pointing out. Now, we'll think of that as a placeholder door, and what we'll do is we'll come back and swap that out with a more appropriate glass door later. But for now, that at least gets the plan correct. So we've got something there representing our intent. So that is all the doors that we can place currently based on what is loaded in this file from the original template. So if you want to load any additional doors, like the bifold doors for the closets or a sliding door for this closet down here, we're going to need to load those families in. So let's talk about how to do that now. So I'm going to click the Modify tool to cancel the command temporarily. And let's make one adjustment to the doors that we've already placed. If you zoom in here, you'll notice that several of them are shifted with respect to their walls. So I'm going to right-click one of these doors, go to Select All Instances Visible in the View. That selects all of them. And what controls that is this masonry frame feature right here. Simply uncheck that, and all the doors will shift and become centered in their walls instead. And I think that looks a lot better. Okay, so now let's move on to loading another door family. Doors and windows are loadable families, and that means that we can load in other families when we need to. So in this case, we need a bifold door for some of our closets and a sliding door for the closet down here in the lower portion of the plan. To get those doors, we're going to load those families in. So you can do that on the Insert tab in one of two ways. If you've installed the content library locally on your hard drive, you can use the Load Family button. If you haven't installed it locally, then you can still access the library from the cloud using the Load Autodesk Family tool here. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to click Load Autodesk Family, and that's going to display this interface. Now, using the globe here, you need to determine which library you want to load from. So I'm working in the United States Imperial, but if you're working in metric, you're going to want to choose the metric library instead. Both of them are organized in the same folder structure, so you should be seeing similar things when you do. So choose the library that's appropriate, and then over here, you should see a doors folder. So I'm going to click that, and you can see all the doors that are available here. Now, I could scroll through the list looking for the one that I want, but it might be a little easier to find if I switch to the residential folder next. That's going to simplify the list to just those doors that are residential in nature, and the one that I want is this one right here. It's an interior double sliding door. So I'm going to select that and click Load. And next, it will display this Specify Types window. So this window is used when there are lots of types to choose from, and it allows you to select just one or more of the types that you want to load. And in this case, we really only need one size, and it's this one right here. If you're working in Imperial, it's 72 by 84. If you're working in metric, go with the 1800 by 2100. So select the type that you want, click OK. That's going to load that family into the project. And now you can go back to architecture and click door or type DR, and it should be already loaded on your properties here. And you can simply place that door in the appropriate space, this closet here in the bottom of the plan. And that's really all there is to loading an external family. So let's repeat that process again, going back to Insert, back to Load Autodesk Family. And the bifold door is unfortunately not in either of the two libraries I pointed out to you, the US Imperial or the US Metric. So we can find it actually in the Australian library. So I'm going to go to the globe here, choose Australia as the region, go to Doors, and then you can see this bifold 2-panel door right here. So I'm going to load that in. This one does not have a type catalog, so it doesn't prompt me to load types, which means that when we go to the doors command, notice that all of the types within that family loaded. In this case, there are 5 sizes. So we can choose any one of those sizes. So start with the largest size and place that one in this closet and this closet. Then we're going to zoom in here in the upper toilet room and open up the selector here and choose the smallest size. And we're going to place that one here. Now, you want to kind of place it carefully so that it goes in the center of that space. And it might do something like that. And if it does, you can just simply enter a new dimension to kind of shift it. So in the Imperial file, I went with 1 inch. In the metric file, that would be about 25 millimeters. Now I'm going to cancel out of the command, select the door, and there are grip controls here and here. So you can flip it left or right. You can flip it in or out of the space. So feel free to adjust and fine tune it later. In fact, you can use the space bar and toggle through all of those options as well. So now that we've placed all the doors, placing windows is a breeze because it's exactly the same process. So to finish this up, I'm going to work with windows that are already loaded in this file, but you are welcome to go to Load Autodesk Family and choose other windows if you desire. But I'm going to click the Window tool, open up the type selector, and I'll work with this double casement window here. I'm going to take the largest size and place a couple of those in the bottom of the plan here in each of these spaces. And then I will take the next smallest size above that and place one of those here in the upper bedroom like so. So feel free to continue in this file and load any additional families that you'd like to experiment with and try placing them. If you don't have access to Load Autodesk Family or you have not installed the local library, then I have provided copies of the families that I used in the exercise files. They're in a folder called OTB. In this video, we're going to place some components in this 2-bedroom apartment unit. Now, just what exactly are components? Well, components can be anything, really. They are a number of different categories that are accessed through the component tool. So when you click the door tool or the window tool, you only get access to doors and windows respectively. But when you click the component tool, you're going to see that if you open up the type selector list, you're going to have items of a variety of categories available to you. So there are light fixtures in here, there are appliances, furniture, casework. There's a variety of different categories available. So components is really just a catch-all term for any number of elements that you can place in your model. So I'm going to start with this dishwasher family right here. There's only one size, so I'm going to choose that. And I'll start off outside the model over here. And what I want to show you is that it attaches it to the cursor, and you can simply place it wherever you want. And you can also change its orientation by tapping the spacebar. So as you tap the spacebar, it'll rotate in 90-degree increments. If your mouse happens to be highlighting something at a different orientation, like this angled wall, and you tap the spacebar, then the 90-degree increments will relate to that angled orientation. If you want to reset that, just move into empty space, tap it one more time, and it will go back to the default orientations. This even works on curved elements. So if I come over here and highlight this curved door swing and tap the space bar, notice that it's now matching that curvature that it inherited from the door swing. Pretty cool. I'm going to come out here in empty space and just tap the space bar again to reset the orientation. Now I'm going to change the orientation a few more times to flip it around this way. And then I'll come into this lower right-hand corner of the plan here, which is the kitchen, and highlight the bottom wall and click to place that dishwasher. I'm going to click the modify tool to cancel, and notice that there's a little built-in offset in that family to allow some clearance behind the unit, which is kind of a nice feature. Okay, so that's a really simple example of placing a component. Let's go right back to the component tool and place something else. So I'm going to scroll up a little bit on the list here, and there are a couple countertops. So it doesn't really matter which one you choose. I'm going to choose the one with a sinkhole like this. Tap the space bar a few times to spin it around, and then I'm going to place it on this exterior wall here next to the dishwasher. I'll click the modify tool to cancel, come back and select the countertop, maybe zoom in a touch so we can see this a little better. Notice that it's got a variety of grip controls on the element. You can easily use these to resize this counter and make it stretch to the width of the room. Depending on the family that you bring in, each one has its own little special features and behaviors. So in that case, that one has an adjustable length. What else can we bring in? Let's go back to component one more time. And there's one more family that's already here in this file that I want to bring in, and that is a toilet fixture. So I'm going to open up the type selector once again. And instead of scrolling through the list and trying to find the toilet fixture, instead what I want to do is take advantage of the search at the top there. So you can notice that the search is active and you can type in anything you want. So toilet seems like a good search term. Let's try that. But unfortunately, that comes up with no matches. Now, what this does expose is that search is only as good as knowing what to search for. So you do kind of want to be familiar with the naming conventions in the file you're working in so that you can search for the appropriate thing. And it turns out in this case that the toilets are actually called water closets. So if you type in the word water, then you're going to see the various toilets that are available. Now there's 3 of them. These 2 are a little bit more commercial. So let's stick with this first one here, which is more appropriate for a residential setting. I'm just going to choose the first item from that list, and you'll see that toilet fixture come in. Now, the orientation is already correct for this bathroom, so I'll place one here, and then in this other bathroom, I'll tap the space bar a few times, spin it around, and place it there. I'll click the Modify tool to cancel out. There may be other items in the component tool already that you can place, but let's move on to the next step, which is what to do when something that you want isn't already loaded in the file. So that's going to happen pretty frequently, and there's a variety of ways that you can access outside content and bring it into your project. So we're going to go to the Insert tab for this, and we're going to start with this Load Family tool right here. So when you click Load Family, it's going to browse out to your hard drive, and there's a pretty good chance you're going to see a screen that looks kind of like the one that I see here. And there's a single item in here, and if you hover over it, it says, if you're looking for Autodesk content, go to autodesk.com and download the Revit content, or you can use the Load Autodesk Family tool. So we're going to do both of those things, but I've already gone to Autodesk.com and installed the library. So I've already done that first step. So I want to show you what that looks like should you decide to do that. If you haven't done that and you want to do that, then you will want to pause this video. You'll need to go download and install. It's going to take some time because it's a big download, but then you can come back and your screen should match mine more closely, or you could just watch what it looks like on my screen just to get an idea. It's up to you. So I'm going to click this little up button here, and that's going to take me to that library that I've downloaded and installed. And you can see it's organized into these folders, and these folders are just based on the different categories of the content items. So let's say that I wanted to place a furnace over here in this utility room. So I'm going to go to this mechanical folder, then architectural, then airside components, then finally furnaces, and there's a single furnace family right there. I'm going to open that up. Go back to architecture, click my component tool. When you load a family, it'll put it right on your cursor. So you shouldn't have to hunt for it. It should already be there. And I'll simply place it where I want it to go. Click the Modify tool to cancel. And it's really just that simple to access an item from the installed library and place it in your model. If you haven't installed the library and you don't want to do the download and install, I've provided copies of each of the families that I'm talking about here in this video. With the exercise files, they're in a folder called OTB, so you can load them from that location, and that would kind of simulate the same thing. What about the other option that it said there? It said we could use Load Autodesk Family. So I'm going to go to Insert, and we've actually looked at this tool in an earlier video, but let's look at it again. It's called Load Autodesk Family, and you can see the little cloud icon here. This is the exact same library that I just accessed, only stored in the cloud, which means you don't have to download and install it first, which is kind of a nice thing. Now, the first thing you always want to check is your locale settings. So I'm using English language and United States Imperial Library, but there are other libraries available. In fact, if you think back to the Doors and Windows video, we loaded a family from the Australia library. So it's perfectly fine to use other libraries if you wish, but I'm going to stick with United States Imperial for this example and just close out of there. The United States Imperial Library has 3,800 families in it. So there's an awful lot to choose from, and I certainly don't want to just sit here and scroll through the list. That'd take way too much time. There are folders we can browse over here, and if you look at them, they actually kind of match the folders that I just showed you in the installed library. In fact, here's mechanical, and when I click that, there's architectural, airside, and furnaces. And there's that same furnace family right there. So it's organized in exactly the same way. And if you're familiar with the library structure, you could just simply browse to it like I've done there. Alternatively, you can search for things. So notice that there's a search up here. This is something you can't do with the locally installed library. So this is one of the things I really like about Load Autodesk Family. So let's say I wanted to put a water heater in that utility room along with the furnace. All I need to do is type in that keyword, press enter, and it will go from 3,800 results down to 3. I can choose the one that I want, click load, and then it's going to load that item in. I can go back to architecture and component. It puts it on my cursor, and then I can place it where I want it to go. Now, another really nice feature of that technique is if I go back to Load Autodesk Family, let's clear the search right here. And this time I'm going to browse by category. So I want to bring in multiple items. So instead of searching for each one, what I want to do is limit the categories here to specialty equipment only. So I'm going to scroll down and locate specialty equipment. And that's because most appliances are part of the specialty equipment category. Now you can further specialize over here in the browse categories, because this is a lot of industrial stuff here, and I don't really want that. I want to stick with domestic maybe only, and then maybe even stick with just high or mid-range. So when I get down to the subcategory that I'm interested in, now I've only got 15 results. It's much easier to browse. So you could look through here and you could say, well, I want a gas range and a refrigerator and maybe a microwave oven. And the cool thing about doing it this way is you can select multiple items and download and install them at the same time. So you don't have to do these one at a time. And so that's another really nice feature of this cloud library. And then again, once you've done that, it's just a matter of going back to the component tool and finding the item and placing it where you want it to go. Let's reconsider this countertop that I have down here. When I placed it, it was fine, but it's a straight countertop, and I don't think that's really the right choice for this particular kitchen. So I'm going to go back to load Autodesk Family one more time. I'm going to clear the search here by going to all results and any here at the top. So that gets me back to 3,800 items. And I'm going to type in counter at the top here and press enter. So now you can see there are quite a few items, but that's what I'm looking for right there is an L-shaped counter. I'm going to load that in. And now I can simply select this family, open up the type selector and change it to the L-shaped one, and you can see that it will swap it right in place there. Then I can select it. It's got similar little grip controls that the other one did, and I could start to stretch that. And there's even little controls to control where the sink is. Now, I prefer to do that numerically here on the properties palette. So if you type in a different number, it will shift that sink over. So I'll let you experiment with that to fine tune the position of that sink and the length of each leg of the L-shaped counter. But that's an example of where you could start with a placeholder and then just come back and swap it in with another family when you find a more appropriate choice. Let's say that you've explored the libraries and you're not finding what you're looking for. So what other options do you have? Well, of course, you can go out and search for something online. Now, there's lots of libraries online. Some are good, some are not so good. Some cost money, some are free. So you'll definitely want to do your due diligence to make sure that you're finding good quality content. But when you do, and once you've downloaded it to your local system, then it's just a matter of loading it like any other family. So to simulate that, I've placed a family in the exercise files folder, and all you need to do is go to load family. I'm going to go to desktop, exercise files, and I've got this bathtub family right here. We're going to load that in, go to the component tool. It comes in kind of small. So I'm going to change the size. You will notice that the sizes are in imperial units, and that's pretty typical of something you might download off the internet. You don't get to decide what units it's in. The person who created the family did. So if you're working in imperial, it might be a metric, and vice versa. If you're working in metric, it might be imperial. But don't worry, it's the size it is, right? So I'm going to choose the 60 by 30 size, which is the appropriate size for this plan. Tap the space bar a few times to flip it around and place it in a couple locations in the model, like so. Feel free to continue in this file, downloading and placing additional components. And when you're done, it should look something like this. When two walls touch one another, they usually join automatically, and typically the join condition that we get automatically is suitable in most cases. However, it's not always the case, and there are some times when we get an unacceptable wall join and we want to adjust it. In cases like that, we have the wall joins tool that we can use to help us adjust the default behavior. So to demonstrate the wall joins tool, I'm going to zoom in over here on the right-hand side of the plan, and I've got a few conditions where we can talk about this. So we're going to start with these walls here that enter into the suite. So these are masonry walls here, and they're butting into these stud walls here. And currently it's not displaying correctly. I would want the masonry wall to continue through and interrupt the stud wall. So we're going to use the wall joins tool to help us do that. Now the interface of this tool is a little tricky at first. So let's go ahead and click the tool and let me show you what I mean. When you first click it, it's not exactly obvious what you're supposed to do. Well, as you move your mouse nearby any intersection, it will highlight the intersection with this little box, and you can go to any intersection you like. So we want to highlight the first intersection that we want to work on, this one right here, and then click. When you click, that will activate a number of choices on the options bar. And then that's how you're going to cycle through the available options. So there's a next and previous button here and here, and you've got 3 different choices, butt, miter, and square off that you can use. So for this example, we're going to just focus on butt and miter. We'll talk about square off in just a few moments. But if I click miter, you could see what it's going to do. That's not really appropriate in this case. So I think the butt joint is definitely the appropriate way to go, but we're just getting the wrong butt joint. Well, all we need to do is click either next or previous, and it will cycle to another option. And in this case, that looks a lot better. So that's the one that I'm going to keep. Now, you would expect there to be an apply button or something like that, but we're done already. So if you wanted to get out of this command, you would just simply click your modify tool and there's nothing more to do. But you can also stay in the command and just simply shift focus from this intersection over to this intersection, and you can repeat the process. It's a butt joint. We click next, and there we go. So you can keep moving around the plan by choosing as many intersections as need attention. And then when you're done, that's when you'd click the modify tool to cancel out. Now, we had butt and miter, but there was also that square off option. So when would you use that? So let's do the wall joints tool one more time. And square off would come into place in cases like this, where you have an acute angle. So what I want to do is click the square off option, and already you can see that it has blunted that corner and applied the condition. Now, that's one possible option. If we click next, here's another possible option. Now, I think I like that one a little bit better. So that's the one I'm going to go with. And then I'm going to shift down to this intersection, square off. I can either do that or that. I think I like this one better. So that's the one I'm going to go with. And then I'll click my modify tool to finish. So you can see where we can use the edit wall joints tool to fine tune the wall joints that we're getting by default. Now, there's one other option that we can do with wall joints that I don't really have a great example for here in this particular floor plan. I'm going to show it to you, but then I'll give you an illustration of a better example when I'm done. So let's say I take this wall right here, and you'll notice that there's these little dots at either end. Now, you can use those dots to actually adjust the length of the wall, right? So if I wanted to change the length of the wall, I can just simply drag that little dot. I'm going to undo that. Well, the other thing you can do with that little dot is you can right click it and choose disallow join. Now, when you do that, if you pull this thing away or bring it back again, it will now completely ignore that other wall as if it wasn't even there. So disallow join is just that. It's no longer applying the join condition. Now, why would you do that? Well, maybe you want a butt condition, something like that. So maybe this is a demising wall and you don't want this one to clean up with it. So you could apply that condition to simulate that. Now, if you ever change your mind and you want to reverse it, there's a allow join icon that will appear next to that joint indicating that it's currently not allowed, and that will simply reverse the effect. So when would you use something like that? So here's a situation where it would be much more common. So here's a commercial floor plan with a curtain wall, and the default wall joins will typically try to join to where this red line is that I've drawn on top here, which means that it would look something like what you see on the left-hand side. But if you use disallow join, you can manually modify it so that the wall butts into the mullion instead of the wall itself and get the proper condition. So that's a more common example of when you would use that disallow join. So anytime you find yourself in a situation where the default wall joins are not giving you what you need or what you want, then you can use edit wall joins or disallow join to edit them to your liking. In this video, we're going to talk about one of the features that makes Revit so powerful, and that is constraints. So you can put a number of constraints on your model that allow you to lock in your design intent, and Revit will maintain those relationships or those rules as the project progresses. So there's lots of interesting ways that we can do this, and I think the easiest thing to do is to show you some examples so you can kind of get the idea. So I'm going to zoom in over here on the right-hand side of this plan, and I'm going to focus on this break room first. And let's say that it's important to me to establish the distance of this door off of this wall and then to constrain that, to lock that in, to prevent that from changing. So let me show you how we would do that. I'm going to come up here to the quick access toolbar and click the aligned dimension tool, or DI. And I'm going to start in the inside face of this wall for the first witness line. And the second witness line, I want to be on the door itself. So when you're moving over here, you want to try and locate the edge of the door. You can see it right there. So make sure it says doors and not wall. Click, and then I'll just click an empty white space to place that dimension. I'm going to click the modify tool to cancel out. And now I want to show you something that's interesting. Even though this is a permanent dimension, if you select the item that's being dimensioned, the door in this case, notice that in addition to getting the standard temporary dimensions here, it also activates the permanent dimension. So I actually use this technique quite a lot. So I actually prefer to draw my own dimensions and then use those as temporaries. And so if I click right here, I can activate that number. And let's say I wanted this distance to be 3 in imperial or 900 millimeters in metric. So I'm going to put that in, enter it, you'll see the door move to that position. But now it's important to my design that that door doesn't change, doesn't deviate from that location. So I'm going to come back and select the dimension, and there's a padlock right here. You just simply lock it. So what does that do? Well, now if you were to take this wall and you were to move it, and I'm just going to drag it a little bit, notice that the door moves with it. Okay. So you could move it left or right, but the door is going to move along with the wall. Now, in this case, that relationship is one-sided, meaning that if I tried to move the door, it won't let me. So the wall is driving the position of the door, but the door can't move unless the wall does, right? So that's what I mean by one-sided. So it really just depends on the two objects that you're constraining, whether or not it will generate that kind of relationship. Let's do another example. Here in Office 108, you can see I've got this window here, but the window is currently off-center, and maybe I want to center it in the room. Okay, so a real easy way to do that is with dimensions. So I'm going to go to Align Dimension yet again, or DI, and I'm going to start with 2 witness lines on the inside faces of the walls in the office, and then the third witness line is going to be the center of the window. So notice if you move your mouse near the center, you can highlight it. I'll click that as a witness line, click up here in empty white space to place the dimension, and you're looking for this EQ toggle next. It might be off screen, so pan slightly if you need to, or zoom, but you just simply want to click that little EQ, and when you do, notice that the window will snap into position and it's now exactly centered between those two walls. That is not a one-time modification, a one-time move. That is now a constraint. So I can demonstrate that by selecting one of the two walls and dragging it. And notice that when I do, the window also moves in order to maintain that centered relationship. So that's another example of a constraint that we can apply. Now, if I zoom out slightly here and pan, you'll see that there's a window across the way. And maybe I want that window to be lined up with the one that I just worked on. Okay, so there's a great tool to help me do that. It's on the Modify tab, and it's called Align. Okay, keyboard shortcut is AL. And with the Align tool, you select one object that you want to use as a reference and then another object that you want to move into alignment, right? So I'm going to start with the center line of that same window that we started with a minute ago. And that's going to establish the alignment reference. And then I want to come down here and pick the center line of the second window. And notice that it will move over and snap into alignment with the first one. So now those two windows are perfectly lined up. If I want to maintain that relationship, lock it in as a constraint, it gives me that option right here. And I can simply toggle that padlock, and now that relationship is established. Let's click the Modify tool to cancel. And actually what I've got now is a nested relationship, because this office up here with its two walls is still controlling the location of this window, which in turn is going to control the location of this window. Let me demonstrate. Let's take this wall here and move it back to its original position. And notice that not only does the window at the top move to stay centered in the room, but it also takes the one down below along for the ride. Okay, so pretty powerful stuff, right? So let's look at another example. For this one, we're going to move over to this side of the plan, and I'm going to zoom out a little bit so that you can see the 4 offices, the left side of the plan. Now notice currently the 4 offices are all random size, and each of their doors is in random locations. That's what I want to address now. So I'm going to start with this door down here at the bottom, and there's a dimension already there, and it's currently set to 6 inches in the imperial file or 150 millimeters in the metric file. I'm going to select that dimension, and what we did over here was we locked it, and you could do that here as well, but in order to get each of these at the same distance, you would have to then move those doors, lock them, move the door, lock them. Let me show you an alternative way to approach this. With that dimension selected, we can come up here to the ribbon, and there's a label option here. You can open up this list and choose a parameter to label that dimension with. Now, you'll notice I don't have any parameters at the moment. The only choice is none. Well, right next to the dropdown is a Create Parameter icon. I can click that. That displays the Global Parameter Properties dialog. Simply type in a name that you want this parameter to have. I'm going to call it Typical Door Jamb and click OK. You can tell when a dimension is labeled with a global parameter because this little pencil icon will appear next to it, indicating that there's a global parameter driving that dimension. And you'll also see it right here when it's selected. So now here's where it gets really interesting. I'm going to select this dimension, hold the Control key down, pick this one and this one. If you look at the Properties palette, it should say Dimensions 3. So now with those 3 dimensions selected, I'm going to open up the Label dropdown and notice that there is a choice now because we've created a global parameter a moment ago. Typical Door Jamb. Let's select that. And notice what happens to the 3 doors. They all snap into position 6 inches away from their respective walls, and they're all displaying the little pencil icon now, indicating that they're being driven by a global parameter. If you click the little pencil, that displays the Global Parameters dialog, and you can edit the value. So consider what we have over here with the locked dimension. If you changed your design and you didn't want it to be 3 feet anymore, you wanted it to be 2 feet, what would you have to do? Well, you'd have to select the dimension, unlock it, move the door, then relock the dimension. With the global parameter, you simply edit the value. I'm going to put in 2 feet in imperial, or you can put in 600 millimeters in metric, click apply, and notice that all the doors will respond. So the global parameter in a lot of ways is a much more flexible way to do this because it allows you to lock in your intent, but it also gives you the flexibility to make changes to it later, right? So I'm going to go ahead and click OK here. So let's do one more example. I'm going to add another align dimension or DI. And I want to equalize the size of all those offices over there. Now, the best way to do that is to control where I place my witness line. So instead of wall faces, I think I'm going to get much better results using the core. And specifically, I'm going to use the center of core. Okay, so I'm going to choose center of core here. And this wall down here, the center of core is where the studs are. This one, this one, this one. So all the studs are the same in those 4 walls because they're right in the center. But notice that the studs on the exterior wall are offset, right? So this is how I'm going to ensure that all of those offices are equally spaced. I'll come outside the plan, click to place the dimension, toggle the equality, and just like that, you'll see that we now have all 4 of those offices equally spaced. And because the global parameter was still applied, all of the doors moved along with it. So now if you wanted to, you could go back and modify the global parameter and change the value, and all of those doors will adjust with respect to their now equally sized offices. So that's another nested relationship that we've kind of built in there. So the last thing I want to talk about in this video is how you identify where constraints are and how you modify them once they're there. So modifying them is easy if the dimension already exists. So the dimension is there, for example, in Office 108. And let's say I decided I didn't want that dimension to be there anymore. You can simply delete it. Now, here's where it gets interesting, though, because if you delete the dimension, you actually get a choice. You could simply delete the dimension by clicking OK and keep the constraint, or you could also unconstrain that relationship. Okay, so it's giving you the option to do one or the other. I'm going to click OK here. And what that does is that means that if I come back later and I move this wall, notice that it's still keeping that window in the center, even though the dimension is no longer there, right? So let's say that you encountered something like that and you found that confusing. So how would you be able to tell where the constraints in a model are? Well, there's a display mode that allows us to turn them on. And it's down here on the view control bar, and it's simply called Reveal Constraints. So we're going to click that icon right there. And that puts this red border around the screen. And now it's very obvious where all the constraints are because they show up in this bright red color. Furthermore, when you select one of those items, it will highlight the objects that are part of that constraint. So it becomes even easier for you to identify where these relationships are and which objects they apply to. Right? Now, the other thing you'll notice is there's some constraints that were in this model that weren't visible. They were here already when we started. So this is another nice way to use this tool, is to identify ones that you're not seeing that don't necessarily have dimensions associated with them. Now, earlier we deleted that dimension and we decided to keep the constraint. Let's say you changed your mind now. It's as simple as selecting the red dimension here and delete. And now this wall no longer drives the position of that window. Now, I did leave the alignment constraint, which means that if I move one of these windows, it will still move the other. So it's up to you which constraints you want to keep and which ones you want to remove. But reveal constraints is a great way for you to identify where they are and make those modifications. So constraints are a very powerful feature of Revit. They can be very useful in locking in your design intent, but I caution you to not get carried away. If you start locking everything and applying constraints to everything, you can get to a situation where you over-constrain the model. The good news is Revit will tell you when you've over-constrained and a message will pop up. It's not always the nicest message to get, but at least it does warn you. So I think in general, if you just have the strategy to constrain those things that are really important to the design and then try not to get carried away, I think you'll be perfectly fine.